Hey everyone, welcome to Sociastrology. Today we are going to take a look at Uranus and Gemini, which is a transit that we have coming up very shortly here. This is a long-term transit, so it's going to go on for about 7 years. And so we'll go through the dates real quick, and then we will talk about some of the history of Uranus and Gemini, which is one of the most significant transits that we've seen in modern history. We'll talk a bit about what it is that we're coming out of with Uranus having been in Gemini recently. We'll talk about Uranus archetypally and what this planet tends to implicate. We'll then talk about Gemini a bit, and then we will extrapolate from all of that as well as the history of this transit to see what it is that we can expect from Uranus and Gemini going forward. I'll then talk a bit about my perspective on this, and then we will dive into the sign by sign. So starting with the dates here, we have Uranus moving into Gemini on the 7th of July of 2025. So in a few weeks here, we're going to start with this energy. It will go forward about a degree into Gemini, and then it will retrograde and leave Gemini back into Taurus on the 8th of November of this year. We will then have it permanently moving into Gemini on the 26th of April of next year, 2026, and that will continue until the 3rd of August of 2032. So that's the bulk of our transit here. It will then move into Cancer, retrograde back into Gemini on the 12th of December of 2032, and it will remain there until the 22nd of May of 2033 when it moves permanently into Cancer. Now that I'm going through these dates, I do want to point out we will get a Saturn co-presence in both Gemini and Cancer with this transit. And so that's going to give us an interesting flavor toward the end of this transit that we'll go into in a future video. But I do want to point out that we're getting an additional very, very, very loud cycle of Saturn-Uranus conjunction that will carry through for about 5 years. And that'll be from the early to mid 2030s, basically. So having spoken to the upcoming dates, let's go back and look at some dates in the past and what we've seen of Uranus and Gemini in recent times. So like I said, this is one of the most, especially geopolitically and also socially significant transits that we've seen in modern history. So it coincides with these absolutely epical changes that take place between nations and then also within nations. And especially for the United States, this is quite an important transit. It does make sense that it would be because the country was founded under a Uranus and Gemini period of time. So this is a return for us. But I do also quickly want to point out, notice here we have 1941 to 1949. Well, there were a lot of nations that wound up going through major rebirth periods of time during that Uranus and Gemini, as well as we had the birth of many geopolitical and international institutions, and all of those in addition to the United States now. And look at how significant this has been for the United States as we go through this. They will also all be going through their first Uranus returns. I know that I spoke to that in a video last year. I may wind up updating that one again, just to take into consideration the way that some things have unfolded, because it can really help us to just be honest about what's going on in the world and look at, okay, how is this likely to interact with these sets of circumstances? So let's go through this backwards a little bit. You'll notice that these points that I have here are themes that we see come up somewhat repeatedly, with the exception of this nuclear development. I put that in there because it's really important for us to not lose sight of the fact that also nuclear weapons are going through their Uranus return as a physical birth of a concept, basically from the 41 to 49 last Uranus and Gemini that we had. But we always wind up seeing civil rights and liberties come up as very important. We'll see that as the fact that Uranus is the major liberator. It is the rule breaker. It's not just going to take convention for granted. It's going to consider how it's able to turn that on its head, or as it tends to do, on its side, and then go from there and make something else work in the place of what the previous structure was. We also always see rebellion and conflict with this placement. We also always see progress throughout the transit, and that might not be, and almost never is, very apparent in the very beginning of the transit. It does take time to unfold with Uranus and Gemini. One thing I will say about all of this quickly off the bat before I forget as well is that you'll notice that in the times previous to all of these placements and the conflicts that have ensued, there has been an aggressor under Uranus and Taurus, which has lost under Uranus and Gemini. So an interesting little tidbit that we might want to also keep our eyes on. We also then have major communications, transportation types of developments, as well as matters of codes and things like this. Like I said, nuclear development the last time, and definitely increased pace, and especially like ideological pace. So the opening, the availability of more, or let's say a broader and less confined and constrained, quote unquote, marketplace of ideas that we tend to deal with Uranus and Gemini. We'll also talk about some other stuff that is kind of always the case, like the fact that alliances always wind up shifting and things like this, with Gemini being the sign of friends. But let's go through this backwards. So the most recent period of Uranus and Gemini, like I said, 1941 to 1949-ish. And that was a period of a major groundswell of anti-fascism as well as decolonization. And so I'm not going to go into the whole history of everything. If you're interested in some of this, you can look at these areas during this period of time, just so that I'm not spending 5 hours kind of going over things that a lot of it we know. But of course, this was World War I. And so there were quite a few different like fascist, very imperialist oriented states that were expanding and that were trying to create broader and broader, at the very least, regional dictatorships, if not global dictatorships. And so we saw with World War I, a lot of that wound up shifting. Some of that wound up being defeated, the loudest parts of that at least. We also then saw major decolonization and progressive movements arising in Indonesia during this time, in Vietnam, in India, in Iran, in Egypt, in Kenya, Guatemala. We also saw women's rights as a major theme throughout this period of time. We'll also mention, I hope, if I have written it down here, we did see some women's rights movement around the next to last one, 1858 to 1866. We saw some groups come together, some active groups. The time before that, 1774, 1782, I know that Mary Wollstonecraft was active during that period of time, and that was really like the birth of, at the very least, Western feminism. Gemini is a gender irrelevant / androgynous sign. It does not take gender into consideration, doesn't see how that distinction really makes much sense. And so it's always going to be revolutionizing along those lines. So we should see a lot more of that as well throughout this time. 1858 to 1866, this was a period of a lot of restoration and reform. And so, of course, we saw the U.S. Civil War. Keep in mind, so World War II, aggressors, they wound up losing. They started their aggression under Uranus and Taurus before 1941. They wound up losing under Uranus and Gemini. 1858 to 1866, this is where we saw the first shots fired from the South and the loss then of the Confederacy to the Union during that period of time. The time before, we saw incidents like the Boston Massacre taking place during Uranus and Taurus prior to the U.S. Revolution. And then we had the successful U.S. Revolution and the defeat of the Crown in the United States. Now, there are definitely aggressions that have taken place where that hasn't been 100% the case, but certainly for the biggest ones, the most history-shaping movements and revolutions during these periods of time, it has been the Uranus and Taurus aggressor that has lost under Uranus and Gemini. So 58 to 66, restoration, reform, U.S. Civil War, led to the restoration of the United States. We saw the unification of Italy under this period of time. We also saw a lot of reform in Russia, Austria, Mexico, India, as well as restoration and reform in China during this period of time. And again, we saw a lot of movement around women's rights during this time as well, in addition, of course, to abolition. Now, 1774 to 1782, what's fascinating about this period of time, this is definitely quite important, is that this is when Uranus was discovered. From my understanding, that was a Saturn-Uranus co-presence in that area of the sky, and that was what helped us to find Uranus. So there is a bit of a relationship, not just, say, between the United States and Uranus and Gemini. There isn't just a connection between all of the post-war nations and institutions and Uranus and Gemini, but there is a strong connection between Uranus and Gemini, as that's where it was when we discovered it. We do also have the North Node, the planetary North Node. This is very wonky, but that's also in Gemini. So I do feel like this is something of a home base where Uranus can really act normally. It can kind of let loose in this place. So 1774 to 1782, this was a period of a lot of revolution and resistance. So of course, we had the US Revolution during this period of time. We had the buildup to the French Revolution during this period of time. And we also had the lead up to the Haitian Revolution during this period of time as well. We also had the British abolitionist movement starting to arise. I will also say that was a thing during the founding of the United States. There were a lot of people who recognized that the rhetoric that was going on around then, the American Republic rhetoric around what they were establishing, there was a lot of abolitionist undertones that were going on that wound up losing out at that time, but of course wound up coming up again in a very significant way, clearly, during the next Uranus and Gemini period of time. We also then had the very beginnings of, like I said, Western feminism. During this transit in particular, we also saw a lot of education reform under this transit as well. And a lot of that also was spurred on by some of the feminist movements. Basically, like I've said, we can see this crucially important periods of history, and Uranus and Gemini has had a lot to say when it is in Gemini, as can be expected. Now, some of the like little random tidbits that I have picked up on from Uranus and Taurus were coming out of this. So I want to point some of this stuff out that has kind of made itself quite apparent to me, is a lot of like off-gridding. So if we look at Uranus as non-conventional, and we look at how it would play out in this very financial and security and agricultural and tradition and comfort-oriented sign of Taurus, we can see how it was playing on those themes and still subverting what was going on in the world through those Taurian themes. It's just that it's a very unnatural place for it to be. So of course we saw the whole off-gridding, into the wild kind of attitudes and scenes and movements and things like this that were arising as people were trying their best to disconnect and not allow for their lives to be dominated by technology. We did, however, see a weird underbelly to a lot of that, which was trad culture really arising during that time. So this whole, quote unquote, trad wives and so forth kinds of things arising that were, of course, establishing themselves as rebellious. But I think that, again, we've seen how that is something of an underbelly to this. And of course, we saw that with the slogans that were used in certainly Italy and Germany, possibly to a strong extent Japan, which were extraordinarily reactionary. And they were looking to the past for solutions for the future. So looking at the present, not liking what they were seeing, wanting to go against that, at least popularly. So when it comes to how people can sometimes get sucked into things that aren't necessarily the best for them, they're looking to the past for solutions to the present. And some of the problems with the present when we're dealing with Uranus in Taurus is that it's pointing out major financial difficulties. And we see a lot of financial instability with Uranus in Taurus. We're not completely out of the woods with that yet, as Gemini has a lot to do with specifically currency, but we'll get into that in a moment. So yeah, reactionary viewpoints, far right, traditionalist, those are some of the things that we wind up running into with Uranus and Taurus. And Uranus in Gemini serves a pretty extraordinary corrective function to all of that, historically speaking. We also then saw under Uranus and Taurus big time workday reforms. So of course we had the whole situation with COVID and a lot of people working remotely, and a lot of people have stuck with that even as there are attempts to get people back to the office. We also then saw the establishment of a lot of independent businesses throughout that period of time, as a lot of people went through layoffs and things like this, and then used their time to create independent businesses or even like artisanal types of works and businesses for themselves as well. We also saw a lot of experiments. That's something we see with Uranus, is experiments with UBI. So with Taurus having a lot to do with income, then experiments with universal basic income, and how that has destabilized a lot of the structural assumptions that we've been dealing with in the past, where people are required to be able to find a job and to work that job for a certain number of hours per week. That seems somewhat outdated and very beneficial to a lot of authorities, that wound up basically being undermined to a great extent. And like I said, we saw a lot of financial fluctuations. Now, I do want to point out those last two things, the UBI and the financial fluctuations, will probably continue to see some more of that because of the fact that some of those qualities do continue into Gemini as well, given that Gemini has to do with exchange and currency. So let's go ahead and talk about Uranus a little bit more as an energy. We'll jump into what Richard Tarnas, who is a wonderful thinker and astrologer and teacher of astrology and mythology, what he has to say about this, because he is usually the best at wording any of this. And then we'll go into it a little bit more with some additional thoughts that I have about Uranus. So if you want to, totally feel free to screenshot this if you want to hold on to this. But this is an excerpt, and I'll do a couple more excerpts as well from Richard Tarnas's book, Cosmos and Psyche. So he speaks of Uranus as associated with the principle of change, rebellion, freedom, liberation, reform, and revolution, and the unexpected breakup of structures, with sudden surprises, revelations, and awakenings, lightning like flashes of insight, the acceleration of thoughts and events, with births and new beginnings of all kinds, and with intellectual brilliance, cultural innovation, technological invention, experiment, creativity, and originality. In addition to the occurrence of sudden breakthroughs and liberating events, Uranus transits are linked to unpredictable and disruptive changes. Hence, the planet is often referred to as the cosmic trickster. Another set of themes associated with Uranus is a concern with the celestial and the cosmic, with astronomy and astrology, with science and esoteric knowledge, and with space travel and aviation. With respect to personal character, Uranus is regarded as signifying the rebel and the innovator, the awakener, the individualist, the dissident, the eccentric, the restless, and wayward. Now, Tarnas associates the archetype of Uranus, because I think a lot of us, given his arguments for this, very much believe his argument that Uranus is a very poor name, or at least a bit of a poor name for this planet. And the archetypal association should probably be more with Prometheus than with Uranus. And so if you know about Prometheus, that's great. I will quote him a bit about this as well, so that we can kind of conceptualize the gift that I find of Uranus. So Prometheus was considered the wisest of his race, and taught humankind all of the arts and sciences. In later tradition, Prometheus was the creator of humankind and thus held a special relationship to humanity's fate from the beginning. Every major theme and quality that astrologers associate with the planet Uranus seems to be reflected in the myth of Prometheus with striking poetic exactitude. The initiation of radical change, the passion for freedom, the defiance of authority, the act of cosmic rebellion against a universal structure to free humanity of bondage, the urge to transcend limitation, the creative impulse, the intellectual brilliance and genius, the element of excitement and risk. So also Prometheus's style in outwitting the gods, when he used subtle stratagems and unexpected timing to upset the established order. He too was regarded as the trickster in the cosmic scheme. The resonant symbol of Prometheus's fire conveys at once a rich cluster of meanings: the creative spark, the catalyst of the new, cultural and technological breakthrough, brilliances and innovation, the enhancement of human autonomy, sudden inspiration from above, the liberating gift from the heavens, the solar fire and light, lightning and electricity, both literal and metaphoric, speed and instantaneousness, incandescent sudden enlightenment, intellectual and spiritual awakening, all of which astrologers associate specifically with the planet Uranus. Another quick little excerpt to where Richard Tarnas is speaking of the planet's discovery. So he goes on to say, the planet's discovery in 1781 occurred at the culmination of the Enlightenment, in the extraordinary era that brought forth the American and French revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, and the beginning of Romanticism. So he speaks to its association, given its discovery during this period of time, as the championing of human freedom and individual self-determination, the challenge to traditional beliefs and customs, the fervent revolt against royalty and aristocracy, established religion, social privilege, and political oppression. So we can see then with Uranus that there is this kind of original, pioneering, insightful attitude to Uranus, where it's able to see how things can be done very differently from the way that, say, Saturn would do things. This is what broke the constraints of Saturn. For all of human history, there was no understanding, as far as we know, of there being planets beyond Saturn. And so it was the outer limit. With the discovery of Uranus, that whole tradition, that whole set of rules, that structure, that belief was swept aside by Uranus. So looking for different ways of doing things than had ever been done prior to this period of time. And it carries with it that energy. So it is very spontaneous and catalyzing. It basically represents a spark or ignition point, which can create this unfolding of a propagation or cascade kind of chain reaction where small input winds up leading to massive system-wide shifts. So we can see then how the surge or burst of Uranus can represent this diffusion or avalanche or threshold tipping point. It's that small input that winds up having that massive ripple effect. And ultimately what this is speaking to is a latent systemic tension that's released explosively. So that tension being represented by an over-reliance upon Saturn, an over-reliance upon the conventional, the rules, the way that things have been done in the past. And so we can see with Uranus, as Rick Levine terms it, these quantum leaps. He speaks of it as the quantum planet. And of course, we can see how Uranus and Gemini the last time wound up weaponizing that kind of an idea. But it can be, at times, in order to effectuate this shift, it can be a bit reckless. It can both split and unite. We've seen that throughout history, especially throughout periods of Uranus and Gemini. But ultimately, it's very restless to destroy arbitrary constraints. And it can look like miraculous accidents, basically, can play out with Uranus, with that gift of the fire of the gods that winds up taking place, and all that archetypally wound up following from that, having that technology, and all of the unintended consequences and intended consequences that wound up unfolding from that, which we could look at as non-mythologically just the discovery of fire by humanity. So again, it's this kind of ignition point of a disturbance in the system that winds up contributing ultimately to progress. But like I said, it can look quite reckless, and it can even look like something of an accident in the moment. Now, finally, there is also a cerebral and ideological edge to Uranus as well. It does absolutely speak to the mind, but it's ultimately wanting to break our minds out of unnecessary constraints. And so it will introduce new ideas, new ideologies, new perspectives, and it will also catalyze those so that we can engage with them, take what is useful from them, hopefully set aside any additionally arbitrary constraints that may come from them, which Uranus would then later need to deal with in the way that it does. But yeah, ultimately that small input can often be just the expression of a new idea, and especially when it is in Gemini. So let's go forward and talk about that a bit. You'll see how I don't take modern rulership, so I don't consider Uranus to be the ruler of Aquarius. It's totally fine if people do. I think that it can function quite well there as well. One of the few ways that Uranus actually aligns in a very beautiful way with the mythology of Uranus is the fact that Uranus was a sky god. And there is a major air quality to it. Air is the least restrictive of any of the elements. It's the least constrained, and it is the most cerebral. And so we'll see in Gemini some of similar themes as Uranus. And so we'll see those things really amplified during this period of time. So where we can expect some of those small inputs to lead to massive system-wide change, where we can expect to see these challenges to tradition or revolt against control and oppression, where we can expect to see some of these splits and unifications would be around exchange, connections, communications, and commerce. So all of how different nodes tend to connect to each other, whether those nodes be banks or human beings or nations, computers, we're likely to see a lot of that explosive energy playing out through that, which does, I fully expect for this to be impacting foreign exchange, exchange rates, the value of currencies, things like this. And that whole area of the global economy to be undergoing major shifts and changes. We will see revolt against control and oppression with communications and things like this. Now, one of the ways that we do see this playing out historically is in codes and breaking of codes. So I'll mention that a little bit more in a moment, but that is something important to keep in mind. And we could even then see this through trade. So the breakdown of trade routes, intentionally or spontaneously, which would in turn wind up impacting that exchange represented by a trade and by trade in and of itself, as well as that would disrupt commerce too. We'll also see this playing out in the realm of thought and opinion. And so, like I said, similarities between Uranus and Gemini. One of the strongest ones is just they do both represent mind in one way or another. Gemini is the quintessential representation of the mind in the zodiac. And so it is the twins. It is the two halves of the brain which are hopefully communicating, exchanging between those two sides. It is the internal dialogue as well as the external dialogue. So the realm of opinion, the realm of discourse, It is the sign of communication, both internally and externally. So like I said, there are new ideologies, new ideas, new opinions, new realms of thought that previously were not as thoroughly explored as this Uranus and Gemini would like for us to do. And so it will help to bring some of those things to the fore so that we can engage on them, see if there's anything of value from them to our time today. And then again, hopefully we can be wise enough to sweep aside anything which is an arbitrary constraint within those new systems of thought, and hopefully avoid any of the potential pitfalls which might be in some of those new solutions. With Gemini, we also then see piers and bridges. And so I mean this in multiple ways, some of which are overlapping between those two things and some of which are not. Physically, bridges, yes, that is represented by Gemini. So we'll want to think about that. For one thing, we may see some really major innovations when it comes to bridges. I know we're seeing some absolutely crazy stuff going on with bridge building that we've never seen before already, but that may really wind up being kicked into high gear. We can also then see bridges literally playing out in terms of Gemini again in trade routes. So the bridges between different countries and things like this. Now, when we're talking about piers and bridges, we are also then talking about networks and how networks wind up connecting together. And so I'll give one literal example to this, although there's many different ways to do this. One example of these things in terms of a network which is overlaying the internet and also has its own network between peers, which is only accessible through this specific network, but the Tor network, which is the Onion Router network project, which runs its own network, is an encrypted network connection to where people who have network constraints, which are enforced, or sometimes just bad people who are doing bad stuff, that is definitely a case of, a use case, sadly, for this network. But it does also then serve to allow for people to get around constraints. And so you have all of these different peers where people can connect through various of these different peers. And then if you're trying hard to not be seen as you are doing this, you can actually connect to specific bridges and have your exit node wind up coming out at a specific location in order to be extra safe. I don't think I explained that as well as I used to. That used to be a small little side job of mine, was to explain the Tor network. But basically all sorts of networks between people as well, and not just the internet. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at here, is that networks of all kinds already exist, and they can be even in the physical. There are things like sneaker nets and stuff like this, where there are archives of interesting materials and stuff like this, where without connecting to the internet, people will give each other USBs with different stuff that they're trying to share between themselves. And they will then add to that archive and then share that and so on and so forth. And that in and of itself is a type of network, even though it's intentionally not connected. Now, we may see additional Tor-like things wind up popping up, but we may also then see the arrival of things like mesh networks, which are alternative connections that are off of the internet, but they are still connected through airwaves, basically to each other, creating a network between various different people. And so we can see disruption of the internet space in that way, which in a lot of cases, I know not every case certainly, is a pretty wonderful thing. It allows for people to connect in ways that specific governments may not be the most fond of. But Uranus can be a double-edged sword. And so we may also see splitting and disruptions to the internet itself, or to the World Wide Web itself. We could see an intentional attempt to split off our countries from each other so that we can't communicate with each other. But one thing I will say is, I don't think that Uranus and Gemini is really going to allow for that kind of a thing. So I would, in situations like that, never advise doing anything that one's government does not love, of course. But there may be alternatives and things like that if something like that winds up arising. There almost certainly are. If and only if that is allowed, of course. Another way this might actually wind up playing out is Gemini also has to do with local space, right? So our communities, the social sphere, our cities, because Gemini tends to, it's Mercury ruled. So it's looking at the smaller cases for the most part. It will deal with international stuff, global stuff, universal stuff, but its main area of focus is on those smaller communities. So in the one case, this could be smaller communities as in online communities, and they may have something of a resurgence where it's not just confined to the big social media companies where it feels not as fun to connect with those anymore. We may see some communities kind of like forums and stuff like that we used to do, or something very new. Because by saying that, I'm looking to the past for a solution. There may be a different solution that we haven't quite thought of yet. And people connecting as peers through those kinds of bridges. But we may also see disruption of networks, as in some of the ideas that have developed under Uranus in Taurus, where we have seen some people attempting to reject some forms of technological control over their lives. Continuing in a different vein under Gemini, where it's not so much isolating oneself or going off grid or going out into the country so that you don't have to deal with the other people around you. We may actually see this in a much more urban way, where people are coming together in their communities, organizing together, hanging out together, hopefully building each other up, offering aid to each other, and disrupting the control that a lot of those social networks have over us through those types of connections, those local connections. And that's not to say that the social networks in themselves won't have a major role to play in this too, but there's a multiplicity, there's a multiplication that always winds up playing out with Gemini. And so to have Uranus there, I expect us to have so many more options than we are probably incorrectly perceiving right now. There's probably already more. Uranus and Gemini will bring those to our attention. Another thing that we tend to see with Gemini is, like I said, it's friendly. It is very open to broad-based community, which is to say it's not the most sentimental of signs. And being opposite to Sagittarius, which tends to run quite thoroughly with a given set of ideas, Gemini can kind of skate along the surface a bit. And its area of specialization, so to say, is information rather so much than knowledge. And so we're likely to be getting little pieces of many, many, many different stories. I hate to say bombarding us quite a bit. I know that we have been dealing with that, especially over the past year, but really for a while at this point. But we have had Jupiter in Gemini over the past year. And so we've seen a little bit of this, but it's likely to get a lot more skitsy with Uranus in Gemini, where it's legitimately just little pieces, little fragments of information that we might be fed from different sources, which might be very overwhelming in terms of there may be a bit of a difficulty seeing the big picture or even conceiving of the big picture because there are so many little fragmented pieces of information which are going on within the broader whole, where it's very difficult to create a grand narrative around everything that's going on. And it's very difficult to connect all of the different moving pieces that are going on. And we may even, that term that I used of it being a little bit skitsy, it is Uranus and Gemini totally. Because like I said, if Gemini is the mind and the bridge, and the bridge between these two parts of the mind, that will be at some points with Uranus and Gemini split. And so because of the fact that we're not capable of getting that big picture, the complete picture of things, people are probably going to feel like they and the world and what they're dealing with is a bit skitsy, like it doesn't make sense. It's full of non sequitur and it's difficult to really get your hands on the entirety of the situation. As I've touched on briefly so far, also currency comes up as it is a tool of exchange. So we've also seen in some of the recent years some developments with cryptocurrencies, certainly the proliferation of them with Uranus and Taurus. We also saw Bitcoin start with Pluto in Capricorn, which was a major disruptor of the established banking norms in Capricorn. And given the way that these definitely financially oriented earth signs of Capricorn and Taurus lead into these technologically and network oriented signs of Aquarius and Gemini, on both sides of that, we're seeing just so much change along those lines, and that's going to continue. With Pluto in Aquarius and with Uranus in Gemini, we're not really getting out of that, but we may see that become both more and less regulated. By that, I mean Pluto in Aquarius and Pluto in Capricorn. Certainly there was discussion of almost immediately and then continuing regulation around those markets, around cryptocurrencies and so forth. With Uranus in Gemini, there will still be ways around that. And now it's likely that rather than just disrupting banking and the financial sector itself, now in these air signs, it's more around exchange. So we may actually see these currencies come into broader use rather than just being ultimately really what they've been so far is mostly tools of speculation. So just contributing to another market similar to stock markets, betting. With the surprises of Uranus as well, in addition to Pluto in Aquarius, I would continue to recommend being as careful as you possibly can around your banking information and any sort of crypto wallets that you may have, because there's likely to be weird bad actors that exist on the network, Pluto and Aquarius, which could cause surprises to our ability to exchange or to our holdings with Uranus in Gemini as well. So extra careful. I'm trying to go through some of these notes that I have that are a little bit less fun and then come to the lighter hearted stuff that I'm a little bit more excited about. Other domains of Gemini, which are likely to be disrupted and amplified, which are to serve as settings for what Uranus is doing during this period of time, also then include learning and education. So again, we can see some of this arising. And one thing I've been harping on recently is that I think that when a planet does its last direct motion in a given sign and it starts leading toward the next, at the very least 1,000% with this last Uranus direct, which happened on the 29th of January, we have seen a lot of Uranus and Gemini types of behavior. For one thing, all of the aviation issues that we've been seeing, but additionally, the education issues that we've been seeing. So major challenges to educational institutions and how that all plays out, whether they be universities or the Department of Education in the United States. When I bring this up and I mention that I don't know what's going on in other countries with regard to that, some people usually will help out and mention, yes, in my nation as well, there are some weird types of reforms that seem to be arising. And so I do apologize that a lot of my knowledge is, a lot of my current affairs knowledge on these more domestic issues is definitely based in the US, a lot more so than anywhere else. So on the one hand, we're likely to see more of that kind of reform and attempts to change or disrupt those areas of life in that way. However, we are also likely to see this play out in different ways as well. So one of the ways we could see this is a lot more distance learning. So one of the things with what's going on with public schools in the US that I personally feel like is going to wind up playing out in a lot of ways is people are likely to decide to, if they can afford it, and I think that in terms of coursework, it's likely to become more and more accessible. But of course, kids not going to school is problematic financially itself. We're likely to see a lot more people engaging with those distance learning courses and schools. And so some of those are likely going to be global. And I think that that is an interesting innovation that's likely to be coming, where primary school kids, middle school kids could wind up really interfacing and learning with each other across borders a lot more. And hopefully then that can contribute to another thing that Gemini always encourages, which is diversity of understanding and ideas, as well as cultures. Additionally, with higher education, again, especially in the US, given the cost of higher education here, given the clampdowns, things like this, but I do know also in some other nations in the West, there are a lot of frustrations around the higher educational institutions when it comes to the narrowing of acceptable thought, as well as the decreasing reward for having gone to a university and having spent all of that time and effort and so forth into developing oneself, and that meaning a lot less in the job market. I could definitely see a lot of alternatives to university arising. So autodidactism, certainly, as well as online courses that are taught by peers and experts, quote unquote, unaccredited programs as well. Now, I would love to see a lot of this become a lot more affordable, certainly, and hopefully find its own footing in terms of quality and standards and things like this. But yeah, we're likely to see a huge amount of disruptions just across that entire field. We may even then wind up seeing some innovations in pedagogy, so around concepts of teaching and how to do that effectively. Hopefully we will wind up seeing some progress along those lines as well. We also see with Gemini the media. So by that, I mean the entire media ecosystem. So mainstream media, as well as independent media, entertainment media, as well as news media, as well as academic media, so journals, things like this. Social media also winds up then playing into that. All media companies, so that including the music industry, the Spotifys and Audibles and other media companies that themselves are already kind of non-traditional, we're likely to see a huge amount of disruption there. Now, what a lot of people are seeking with Uranus in Gemini will be alternatives. So I think that this, as far as alternative and independent media goes, I think that this is ultimately going to serve as something of a boon along those lines, and therefore re-diversification of the media, which has become, again, at least across the West, extraordinarily concentrated within the hands of a few investment firms and billionaires. So we can see that on independent websites, we could see that on YouTube, we could see that on Substack. And the funny thing with that is, too, there's a relatability that is valued by Gemini. It wants to deal with things on a peer level. It's not looking up or down. It's looking across. That's what Gemini does. It's in part why diversity is always assisted with Gemini as well. It is perhaps the most human sign that there is, with it literally being represented by humans. And so the relatability of the people that we're able to connect with on these peer networks like Substack and YouTube, and even in our local communities, is likely to be something that people really value quite a bit. As pundits and so forth, they're billionaire owners of those networks, wind up paying them more and more and more and more, such that they can no longer really relate to the people that they are trying to speak to. You know, so I think that that's going to be a major issue. And so hopefully some independent journalists can really make their mark during this period of time. But this is, like I said, beyond news media. This is also entertainment media. And one of the things which is weird, I don't know how I feel about this yet, is that some people are saying the AI movie making type of thing is going to allow for people with much lower budgets to be able to express their imagination through film at a much lower cost. So in some cases, it does seem to be lowering costs of entry for these very elaborate kinds of scenes that are very expensive to make and often only confined to the realm of the major Hollywood production companies and so forth. We may even wind up seeing, like, I think it is a bit of a thing. I haven't seen a bunch of it yet, but like serials that could be on YouTube or wherever else, where it's not just films, but it's an actual series, which is released not through a production company and not through like Netflix or whatever, but which is story focused. That's another thing we see with Gemini is stories, the ways that we conceptualize of our daily lives. Gemini has a huge amount of input in that area. And so again, we're going to be telling stories in different ways and be those non-fictional news stories or imaginative, visual or prosaic stories. The content of those, the way that they are structured, the way they're told, and the way that we receive those are all open for a major overhaul with this Uranus. Another area that Gemini claims some domain is travel and transportation. And especially, I'll give a few different examples because Sagittarius, the Jupiter-ruled signs, do have other kind of specific areas of focus when it comes to this. But with Gemini, we do see local travel. We also then see long-distance travel when it comes to exchange, so trade. And we also see aviation and air travel, potentially also space travel. I don't know that we really know where that is going to be. It's probably in a lot of Aquarius and Gemini there. Probably some Sag mixed in. But so we're also then likely to see a lot of innovations and disruptions in these areas. So hopefully not more reckless driving, though that could definitely be the case. And that would also wind up disrupting commutes, hopefully not more frequently, but I could definitely see that being the case. There is a speediness to that Uranus and Gemini, so that's something I would just be extra cautious about. But hopefully then we don't additionally see like bridges having issues and disrupting commutes in that way. Hopefully we can see more trains offering alternatives to the way that places commute. We could, of course, also see a lot more like automation, self-driving cars, as well as drones used for different things, short distance air travel. Another way we could see the commute disrupted would be more work from home options. So we might see more of that also in this way. It's a digital commute, basically. We will likely also see some major developments when it comes to air travel. So new types of flight, possibly some airplane creating companies, I don't really know what those are called, that are very disruptive as well, like of the space, like very innovative, essentially, and wind up taking a greater part of the market. We could even see the disruption of some airline companies or airplane making companies, as in loss of market share. I think we can all think of one that we're a little frustrated with at this point. But yeah, I mean, even if we look at this kind of conceptually, this is a disturbance of the air. So hopefully in some cases that is not a rough disturbance, which is coming from the air in some places in the sense of really bad storms or missiles or whatever. Though that is very likely to be the case, then increased drones, as well as information warfare, narrative warfare, which also speaks to a disruption in the airwaves. But looking at this a little bit more locally, hopefully also not, like one thing that I've heard is that there's a lot of physicists who are very frustrated with how many satellites there are at this point because it's disrupting their work. The sky is getting blotted, just not in a way that is extraordinarily disturbing to the naked eye quite yet. But that might become more of a thing where we wind up with sky pollution, where even in areas where we're supposed to be able to see the sky very clearly, not able because the problem might be satellites. We could also then see potential issues with the drones and stuff like that, even in local places where they may also be disturbing the skies. They may also, if they're private companies, be having faults to them and having some things falling from the sky at times. There's going to be a lot of experimentation in the air and in the sky, and that'll be for better and worse. And yeah, again, I'll be harping on it quite a bit, but trade lanes and things like this are likely to be very disrupted, both with the Saturn-Neptune co-presence as well as this Uranus in Gemini. Another thing that Gemini has to do with is multitasking. And so I'm hoping that we don't go really overboard with that of stimulation overload or very intense attention deficit issues where people have a very difficult time focusing on just one thing. But I would not be surprised to see something like that where multitasking is somehow the expectation. There may be some revolt against that, certainly with Uranus here as well. But again, it's very likely to be difficult to focus with Uranus and Gemini. It's really going to be working on our minds and on our nerves and having those subject to a lot of jolts and noise. Another thing we see with Gemini is dialogue, dialectic, discourse. So the communication and debating of ideas and information, opinions, thought, and how that can dialectically be shaped by discourse. So very much increased communication with each other, for sure. Doing that in different ways and about different types of topics, looking at things in different ways and then presenting those kinds of ideas publicly in order to be engaged with, both positively and negatively, I'm sure. But we're likely to get some pushback of the ideas that have been established for a while and that have become a very faulty given. So the assumptions that we make and that we build our worldview upon. So matters of, especially where there's a dictation. So when it comes to exceptionalism, when it comes to rules for thee, not for thee, when it comes to whose voices we consider to be authoritative or worthwhile, expert or authoritative, we could see that really being challenged throughout this time in this dialectic, which it's usually these assumptions are not subjected to. They don't need to explain themselves. And so we can be getting very new ideas coming from all different angles. We could be seeing a lot more experiential expertise rather than the expertise which is claimed by those who study a subject from afar and never actually engage with the topics at hand in a very real way, which is to say, in a huge amount of cases, policymakers. We could then be getting a lot more dialogue from cultures where we have a very myopic view of what that culture is or what that framework is that different countries or different peoples are working from. With Gemini also ruling intelligence, a lot of our own inherent ignorances about different types of people from different places and why it is that they do what they do, why it is that they value what they value or believe what they believe, is likely to be highly disrupted by this Uranus, where those assumptions are undermined and where it will require splitting the mind in this way in order to maintain a lot of very ignorant viewpoints that have been inculcated in people all over the world about each other. So greater dialogue with new types of people in order to, with Uranus in Gemini, serve as a boon to diversification of thought and understanding. And speaking to that, One of the things that we're likely to see some really wonderful breakthroughs with will be translation. So doing this much more in real time, some of that is already starting to pop up this year, much more so than it has in the past. We're likely to see a huge amount of improvements upon that and experiments with that, which will ultimately wind up refining that, such that we don't need to rely on one given translation of what someone is saying, but can look at that in different angles and hopefully can then engage in those translations and those ideas a little bit more. And yeah, as I mentioned, Gemini, big time on diversity, very androgynous, does not care about gender, barely recognizes its existence. And so Uranus will be shaking things up in favor of that as well in this place. So attempts to control certain groups of people either and compartmentalize them and demonize them based on where they're from or what they look like or what they believe or based on gender or sex or anything like this, those are likely to be subject to a lot of blowback and little miraculous accidents of blowback as well from Uranus. Now, finally, one of my favorite things about this upcoming transit is that it will be working in this most wonderful area of Gemini, in my view, which is humor and youthfulness. And so Gemini isn't known for taking things all that terribly seriously, especially matters which take themselves too seriously. And so we're likely to see some really wonderful satire and humor and lightheartedness around some of the conflicts and challenges and the weightier issues that are going on. There's going to be some really wonderful, I think, people, and then ways that we all connect with each other about those issues, which should be pretty effective in reminding us to take all of this a little less seriously, including some malignant authorities and things like this, which is to say, if we're taking that less seriously, there's a lack of a belief in those kinds of hegemonic or megalomaniacal kinds of dictatorial attitudes where someone takes themselves so seriously that they believe that they have a right to just make a bunch of rules for other people. It'll be taken less seriously in the sense of satire. So some really brilliant satire coming through around the Emperor's New Clothes kinds of concepts that we're going to be engaging with in these coming years. But then additionally taking them less seriously as in orders not working. So dictatorial attitudes just being very ineffective throughout this period of time. Also, when it comes to youth and youthfulness, for one thing, we have a couple at least, generations coming into broadly recognized adulthood that themselves have some pretty flexible ideas about what that looks like themselves. So likely we will see millennials certainly not taking super seriously matters of age and remaining quite youthful, even as our years advance in these coming years with Uranus and Gemini. And that in and of itself should also serve as something of a boon to youth. The fact that there is a generation of adults that are very open to youthful attitudes and youthful ideas and changes that young people tend to be especially capable of introducing in times of great challenge and upheaval and change and things like this. So this will be a boon both for the youthfulness of adults and the ability to hopefully remain as lighthearted as possible throughout this time and not get into the kind of rigidity that we can sometimes see with generations, but then also a greater support for young people and younger generations than millennials. Another thing I do worry about with this when it comes to youth is disruptions of youth and surprises to youth. And one of the ways that that can play out is in a draft. And that has come up repeatedly with Uranus and Gemini. The past 2 times in the States we've had drafts. And so hopefully we do not see something like that again. But yeah, some of the ways that we'll see this playing out is through this frictionless kind of quick, hyperactive means through which Gemini behaves. We'll also see a highlighting of dichotomies and divergences, these kind of like multitudinous, bipolar or multipolar subjects and manners of solving for problems. So many different solutions to a given issue, many different perspectives on how to deal with things. This being a major theme as well, and a divergence of opinion on things. I do expect, given the bifurcation that can happen with Gemini and the splitting energy that can come with Uranus, of there being at least 2 or 3 sides of some major matters that are coming up where people are feeling the need to either bridge between those in unique ways or to fall on one or another side. And I don't think that that's going to line up entirely in the ways that might be the most intuitive around that, because again, this is multitudinous. So you'll wind up with, for instance, if this is something around multipolarity or something like this, you may see different sides within the different sides and so forth. Also, then we can see multiculturalism as well as blending arising with this energy. So in addition to splitting things apart, also bringing together different forms in new and innovative and interesting ways, which are supportive of progress. And so we'll also see some themes of boundary crossing, cross-pollinating, like cross-platform, cross-channel kinds of energies where that the bridge between things is really highlighted, and where we see that as a theme that arises within different topics that we're dealing with in the coming years. But we can also then get into dilemmas with Gemini as well. Uranus is not going to necessarily support a dilemma remaining for very long. It's likely to push something off the fence if something stays on a fence for too long. But when dilemmas do arise, it's likely that it will be very uncomfortable and that we will deeply feel that transitional or liminal state between things. This is also a transpersonal sign. So I do hope that this can serve as something of a balance, similar to Pluto in Aquarius versus Saturn and Neptune in Aries, which might be reinforcing some of the more selfish or self-oriented themes of recent years, where we've seen a lot of people with a main character syndrome kind of a problem, so to say. So I'm hoping that this can also serve as something of a corrective to some of the themes that we may see of that remaining with Saturn and Neptune in Aries. It is the transpersonal where a lot of the shifts and changes are arising and emanating at this in these coming years, really. All right, so with all of that said, let's go ahead and dive into what we can expect from Uranus and Gemini this time around a little bit more specifically. So we are likely to get a lot more insights on mind and consciousness and perspective. That's one thing that I'm kind of excited about, is that we're likely to be learning more about how our minds work, how consciousness works, how it is that perspectives are shaped. So especially when it comes to the science of those things, I expect for there to be a lot of breakthroughs along those lines. We'll also have a lot of new stimuli, and people are going to be responding to that in polarized ways. Some will resist integration, and they will wind up splitting mentally, leading to cognitive dissonance and extreme reactions, while others will attempt to build bridges out of this. And so this is part of what will lead to one of the bifurcations that we're likely to see with Uranus and Gemini, is how it is that people react to the increased pace of information. This is likely to trigger rigid minds the most, And they can wind up then reacting very extremely to try and deny or destroy the other perspective. And especially when it comes to the fresh perspectives and narratives, as well as the shocking information, revelations, things like this, that we're likely to see during this time. So Uranus in Gemini is going to be targeting those narrative frameworks to push for radical shifts in worldview, to challenge old paradigms. And some are going to react to this in very extreme ways. But on the other hand, this can also lead to some really wonderful bursts of brilliance, new connections, new alliances, the unexpected unification of different ideas and different perspectives. So some are going to attempt to bridge that gap, while some are going to attempt to break down any ability for someone to be able to cross those kinds of bridges. So we'll definitely see more technological advances than expected as well, and that'll be a global phenomenon, especially when it comes to advancements in encryption, but also the breakdown of some encryption. We'll certainly see some attempts to open source, but again, that's probably going to be another field of challenge and conflict as people try to liberate information from existing confines and constraints. Additionally, as I mentioned, Gemini, due to its association with Mercury, does have to do with small things or making things smaller. And so we're likely to see a lot of these attempts to make technologies smaller and smaller and smaller, like chips and things like this, smaller and smaller, possibly to some major extremes, resulting in advancements within quantum computing, possibly pushing that to, or potentially even beyond, who knows, the physical constraints, the constraints of physical laws. So platforms and form factors for communication and commerce, as well as travel and transportation, are likely to change and face a lot of disruption. We already discussed this about the media undergoing a lot of disruptions, potentially the rise of a lot of independent voices within media, especially if there is a concentration among the mainstream voices around narratives. Additionally, then, a lot of innovations in colloquial communication, so meme culture. I wrote vitality here, I meant virality. Things taking off, things really like shaping the trends of communication and creating new directions in which our everyday communication, our colloquial communication with each other, and how it is that we exchange cultural information and cultural cues are likely to, for one thing, innovate quite a bit during this period of time, but also proliferate a lot. So we'll also see a lot of digital currency developments. There might be issues or shocks around regular currency like paper money, certificates, bonds, gold, things like that. And those markets could wind up being undermined by this Uranus in Gemini, which is not going to be as focused on supporting those as it is new markets and new currencies, new ways of managing currencies or utilizing currencies. We also already mentioned trade disruptions, efforts to destabilize financial institutions. We could see that being kind of weaponized as well. Maybe not so much domestically, though maybe so. But I would expect also new financial instruments to start to arise as well. And I have no idea what those would be. And I'm definitely not a financial advisor, but I do find this transit quite fascinating from a financial astrology perspective. So we'll also see some new disruptive industries and marketing also emerging. So new companies, new industries, new ways of advertising that and selling that, new markets as well. So trying to target different types of markets and so forth. And yeah, especially like when it comes to that, new markets and so forth, there is likely to be, as much as there's disruption in transport, logistics, and so forth, we're also likely to see a lot of that experience some level of brilliance, especially against barriers. So barriers that are erected when it comes to transport or logistics, there being some workarounds that are found. We should also be seeing some major advancements when it comes to women's rights, diversity increasingly being celebrated, social progress, radical community building, and reorganization of local and global groups of people. So again, new alliances, new friends tends to come up with Uranus and Gemini as well, as this brings together these kinds of divergent ideas and disciplines and things like this. And that can then bring people together along the lines of affinity groups. And that can be locally, or that can also be globally. Also, as mentioned, Gemini is not the biggest fan of hierarchies. So those hierarchies and regressive systems are likely to be facing very relentless challenges. And really, it's all of the outer planets tend to support the subversion of structures, of constraints, and they will all be in flowing aspect to each other. And what's interesting is that in the beginning of this, they're really honing in on Saturn, which is going to be right at the heart of the alignment of the outer planets in the beginning of this. But then as that Saturn moves on, it's going to have less and less of a hold on what it is that Uranus and Neptune and Pluto are going to be doing to undermine the status quo in the coming years. So also expecting a major systemic overhaul in the coming years too. And that from this Uranus and Gemini perhaps foremost, and then additionally from Pluto in Aquarius and Neptune in Aries. We've already covered some of this as well. Advances and shocks. I guess I got ahead of myself a bit. Advances and shocks in aviation, logistics, also smart cities. So that's one of the ways that I think there might be some top-down disruption when it comes to communities, is through the attempts to create smart cities in various countries and various locations. Also very likely to see some space travel or space, like stuff that's going on up in the space and up in the air, for there to be a lot of disruptions and innovations and just more stuff up there basically that's connected and that we're dealing with, and that in and of itself might be creating disruptions. Now I have here written grid and energy breakthroughs, but yes, we'll see some of that, but we may also see some grid breakdowns, so more outages and things like that, even as we have like the coming online of smart cities. So again, major bifurcation when it comes to, are we able to handle the basics and yet we're trying to do all of these innovations, kinds of questions arising. And that may be very, very frustrating. But yeah, I just mentioned the problem solving and transport amid barriers. Again, alliances are also implicated here. So destabilization of traditional alliances, matters of NATO, UN, IMF, these are all of those post-war, not all of them, but there's more than that. But these are some of those post-war institutions that are going through their first Uranus return at this point. I think the IMF was right off the bat. I might need to be checked on that, but certainly NATO and the UN. And those facing new agreements, new groups, new groupings, new treaties, new opinions emerging about those traditional alliances, and then also in the creation of new alliances and things like this. So again, transitional, bipolar kinds of, possibly even multipolar global atmosphere arising, which is requiring a redefinition of how it is that we relate or connect, Gemini, to each other, in a way which is sovereign and novel with Uranus here. And probably, again, like I said, with opinion and thought and ideas and stuff like that arising with Uranus, possibly feeling a need to pick sides along those lines. Additionally, with Gemini ruling the twins, we have seen civil disruptions quite a bit with this placement in the past. Obviously, we had the Civil War, and there were, in the last Uranus and Gemini, a lot of different skirmishes and challenges and conflicts throughout the process of decolonization and all of the efforts that were made during the 40s. But so we could see certainly civil unrest, domestic issues like that, as well as familial splits. I was hoping that Jupiter in Cancer might help with this a bit, but that's only going to be for about a year. And this one is likely to contribute, I hate to say. In some ways, families will come back together again, you know, but I feel like this is going to split families a little bit more too. It's disrupting the family, the brethren. So some pretty extreme ideas arising around this time as well. A lot of erratic push and pull momentum where something seems to gain speed and then get halted and then gain speed and then get halted. But overall, a major quickening of change such that I know there's this quote of, I'm going to butcher this. This is paraphrasing, and I don't even know who made this quote, but it's sometimes it can feel like weeks of change happen in decades, and sometimes it feels like decades of change happen in weeks. This is going to incline a little bit more toward the latter, where it feels like, wow, that was only a week. It seems like everything has changed since then. And I do have to say, I took a break in the middle of this video a little bit ago, and I learned some pretty crazy news that I was expecting, but that definitely puts us into something of a new world. So those things can happen insanely quickly. So hyperactivity, anxiety, very frantic energy to this. And those will be both for good and for bad. So hopefully we can try and do something with and channel that energy as we feel it arise into something. But yeah, other than that, all of that, some thoughts that I kind of wrote down here is that this period of time is likely to feel like something of an exposed circuit, more or less continually in a state of acute malfunction and ad hoc troubleshooting. So new ideas lighting up very, very quickly, and possibly just enough in terms of lighting up to show us what we can't see. And so some are going to use this enlightenment to build those bridges between different viewpoints, but others will wind up reactively splitting their minds in two in a form of really extreme cognitive dissonance and wind up digging in where it's full on rules for thee, not for me, and just going all in on that. And the more rigid that they are, the harder they're going to wind up swinging against any sort of competing perspective. So encryption will falter at times, and that will wind up releasing data as well as codes. But this could even wind up then bringing more questions than answers, the releases that wind up taking place during this period of time. And every time the story changes, what seems possible is going to shift. So it might feel like something of a bad mashup between like concluding scenes of what's ultimately an open source sort of historical sci-fi that is unfolding that we wind up finding ourselves in during this period of time, where it feels like, and then there's a twist, and then there's a twist, and then there's a twist, and yet all of us do have some input into how these things are unfolding and what the ultimate conclusion of this story will wind up being and how this history will unfold. So it's going to feel like we're in fast forward here. You know, communications, payments, travel routes wind up shifting apparently overnight. Tech is going to really wind up sprinting ahead in these years. Digital currency spiking, crashing, spiking, and paper money feeling a lot less real as well. And then, yeah, it's like the basic technology of electrical grids and things like this are going to wind up coming under strain, even while we advance technology beyond our previous conception with smart cities and so on and so forth, transferring so much data. And yet, can our electric grids even handle basic use? One thing I'm excited about here is that scientists, artists, intellectuals alike, they're likely to wind up stitching together their fields and kind of creating this dialectic to create and solve unnecessary complications. So there will be people on many different sides, some of them utilizing their educational backgrounds to create problems for humanity, while some others will be working together to come up with very innovative ideas of how to solve the problems that others are creating. The old hierarchies built on habit will definitely waver under this influence. So those outer planets really agreeing on breaking down what no longer works. And so ultimately through this process, even though it's going to look like an extraordinarily bumpy road, rights will ultimately expand. Independent media will help to cut through some of the noise, but in all directions. Drafts, both militarily and ideologically, will wind up pulling youth into causes that may not have even existed the year before. So there's this kind of background hum of anxiety that is encouraged by the pace and the pressure of this period of time. Alliances are going to be rewritten during this time, trade lines facing blockages. Some logistics routes will wind up finding ways to bend around those obstacles. And yet in all of that churn, there will be connections that form that couldn't have been planned previously. So clever workarounds and loopholes will become necessary where rules have stalled. Propaganda is going to be appearing both homemade and high budget at once. So there will be attempts with all of this, especially with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, for the imitation of real people. So we could see this in the case of deep fakes, which is, very high budget, very high technology, and yet trying to imitate what some actors may not have in this environment, which is a genuine connection to the masses, to humanity writ large, and to what regular people's values are. And yet trying to imitate that, trying to manipulate by imitating regular people. So currencies, moods, narratives, all subject to swinging between extremes. And families, nations are going to be choosing different sides of the divide, even internally. And yet underneath all of this, there will underlie a belief that something better could still wind up being built if we stay quick on our feet. So most important is that change is not some kind of background noise or a backdrop to what's unfolding during this period of time. It is the main character. It's always mid-stride. It's always right in the middle. And basically daring us to match it from one tipping point to another, the way that, again, only the human mind can, and despite all of the increasing imitations of the human mind and human connection. And yet, amidst the chaotic pace of all of this, new communities will be formed. There's going to be this serendipitous type of draw for different people toward others who are reflecting their own minds and values. The young at heart will wind up igniting these small sparks that spread wildly, spontaneously releasing, again, that latent systemic tension in a flash. And so satire, laughter, keeping a light heart, that is really going to wind up reigning in this period of time and reminding us to take these divisive types of machinations that we're likely to see during this period of time much less seriously in many different ways. But yeah, I think that that's most of what I have about Uranus and Gemini. So I'm going to go into the sign by sign, but before I do, I just want to sign off since we usually do timestamps and then go our own separate ways. So thank you all so much for being here, for spending this time with me. I hope that this video was helpful in some way. And if you don't mind giving a thumbs up, I would greatly, greatly appreciate that. And do consider sticking around by subscribing. I would love to have you here for future videos. And I'd also love to thank the members of this channel for your support. So Angel Niblock, Michelle Howell, JJ, Deborah Keel-Levitt, Gary A., Startlingly True, Patrick McKenney, Jody Z., Anne Marie, C. Rezer, Peace Out, Maria Cyril Hyro, Rachel Windholtz, Lisa S., Aya, The Z-Man 1291, Lynn Newman, Long T. Standing, The Nelson Cat Maya, Connie DiMartino, Dali Gizi, Mango JT, B Love, Ellen McCormick Martins, Grace, Fluffy Cut, Psyche Lloyd, and Noah. Thank you so much for your support of the channel. Much love to you guys. And if you would like more information about memberships, perks, and stuff like that, there's information about that in the description box below. And other than that, I hope that this transit treats us all very well. And do be good, be safe, and I will talk to you soon. Bye. All right, so for Aries, Uranus is going to be in your 3rd house. And so this has to do with the local environment. It has to do with communications and learning, connecting with others, the people, places, things around you. And so you're likely to see a lot of ongoing shifts, possibly even disruptions, sudden moves taking place within your local environment, with your neighbors, with siblings. And that may feel a bit destabilizing, almost like the environment around you won't just settle down. This can also play on your mind a little bit. So I would caution for you a little bit more about the mental hyperactivity. Try, if you can at all, to make time for yourself to allow for your mind to process the information that it's taken in as you can. Additionally, travel and technology is likely to be very unpredictable. So I would be extra careful when you're handling your technological devices and things like this. Drops and breakages and things like that are more likely. And you may wind up finding yourself traveling when you didn't quite expect to. You may even wind up moving. Again, if this is your community, if your community is shifting and changing, that in and of itself can indicate a physical move. Oh yeah, I do have written here, thank gosh. Mental restlessness, scattered focus. So those are some things to try and keep in mind that you might need to work a little bit harder during this time to push through. But you're also likely to have wonderful moments of brilliance and wonderful moments of just the perfect words coming to mind, an ability to communicate in a way that is very sharp and very distinctive and enables you to express yourself deeply authentically. And you may even, if you have constrained yourself in your communication in the past, that Uranus there is not going to allow for that. So you may find yourself less restrained when it comes to what it is that you're saying. So in mixed company or in certain circumstances, you might want to think about that, because things might just slip out in very honest ways. Additionally, then new interests, so especially new mental interests. But even new communities can be indicated here. So if you pick up a hobby that has some community aspect to it as well, that could also be implicated by this. And then, yeah, a lot of like just shocking information, illuminating information, revelations coming through communication or things that you're learning or even teaching. You might have, if you're a teacher, some really wonderful pedagogical breakthroughs during this time too. But then also your engagement with media is likely to shift quite a bit during this time. So you may find yourself engaging with it a lot and then not so much, and then a lot, not so much. And then you may also find yourself consuming different types of media than you have previously, even different types of music and things like this. And then, yeah, there's going to be some challenges, again, to how you communicate. And this is really about you finding your voice amidst all of the noise, amidst all of the weird information that we're going to be getting during this time. You making up your own mind for yourself about matters, and then finding your voice within all of that noise. But yeah, I think that is most of what I would have for you, Aries. So I hope that this transit treats you really wonderfully. And thank you so much for being here. All right, so for Taurus, we have Uranus in your second house in Gemini. And so this is the area of your finances, your income, your sense of security in yourself, and your sense of self-sufficiency. And so there's likely to be some disruptions as well as breakthroughs when it comes to your income and your sense of security. So these may come through in these kind of serendipitous ways where it feels like you're being pulled toward a different kind of an income source or an additional kind of an income source. And so if there are any disruptions when it comes to your income, that is one thing that I would assure here, is that this is just as likely to bring in something new as it is to upend some source of income, if not much more so to bring in something new. This may also then wind up affecting your sense of values too. So you may find yourself identifying much more strongly with different types of values than you have before, or really plugging into those things. So especially when it comes to matters of your place in the world, how you feel about how you show up, how you feel comfortable showing up, this is likely to have you feeling a lot more liberated along those lines. But even when it comes to your worldview and things like this, your values in that sense, this can also be impacting that and bringing in new information, which winds up informing those values of yours. So market shifts and investment opportunities very likely also to be impacting your own personal finances. And so you may find some really wonderful investment opportunities during this period of time, but I would be not just flying by the seat of your pants when it comes to investments. The one thing that we can be sure of is that there's nothing that's a sure thing when Uranus is involved. And the more that we think that something is a sure thing, the more likely it is that it will push back against that and bring in a different type of a surprise. So do try to be very smart about the investments that you wind up making during this period of time, but you are likely to be presented with more opportunities, and some of those could be just absolutely wonderful. And this may even be something that you've already invested in that takes an interesting turn. So really taking the time to assess what's really worth investing in, not just in terms of like investment opportunities, but what's worth putting your money and your energy into. Does it really increase your quality of life to be purchasing this or that kind of a thing? Is it going to take more energy than it's worth to maintain something that you might think about investing in? Thinking about those kinds of things. Is it really worth it? Is it really going to increase your quality of life or your sense of purpose or connection with yourself and sense of self-sufficiency? And if it's not, you may wind up making some different kinds of decisions when it comes to investments than you have in the past. So yeah, innovations and how you earn, side hustles, trades, sudden entrepreneurial sparks could wind up arising as well. And some of that may have major communication types of themes underlying or technological themes underlying, just given the fact that Gemini and Uranus are involved in this. Another thing, since this is acting on mind, and especially so since it's in Gemini, in terms of scarcity mindset or a sense of insecurity, there's a desire here and a really wonderful opportunity to utilize this transit in order to liberate yourself from that. So breaking free of the potentially arbitrary or even false constraints around your ability to maintain your resources or your ability to roll with the changes that wind up arising. You may actually find that you're a lot better at improvising than you would think. And sometimes being put in the position to improvise in a certain situation, you may even find that you wind up coming out of those moments with an even stronger footing than before. So yeah, I think that is most of what I have for you, Taurus, for this transit. So I hope that it treats you super well. And thank you so much for being here. All right, so for Gemini, Uranus will be in your first house in Gemini. And so this is a very special transit for you. This is really all about liberating and reinventing yourself throughout the coming several years. So your identity may wind up shifting quite a bit during this period of time, and that may wind up becoming very surprising for you, but especially for the people around you. And that may be on the level of how you present yourself, your aesthetic, your perspective on matters, your ideology, your belief system, what it is that you value. Everything that contributes to your sense of identity is subject to potential reinvention throughout this period of time. And it's likely going to be across many, if not all of those categories. However, the first house, it has to do with you, yourself, your identity, how you show up, but it also has to do with your body. And so there can be some major physical restlessness and some especially strong anxiety to which you're probably already a bit prone, given the Gemini in your chart. And so with this coming to the first house, it can make you even more physically and mentally restless. So it'll be necessary to watch for insomnia and hyperactivity, as well as just trying your best to ground yourself whenever you have opportunities is going to be the best way to deal with this. Yet I do need to caution, it's probably going to be harder to do that than usual. So just do your best and try not to be too terribly hard on yourself if you do find yourself having a little bit more difficulty grounding or meditating or whatnot than usual. Your energy levels are also likely to be quite erratic. So you could wind up being very, very motivated, have a huge amount of momentum, and then just kind of hit a wall and burn out or wind up fragmenting or wind up finding, wait, I followed a bunch of different threads when it came to this, and now I'm having trouble bringing them back together. And so when you feel moments like that, I wouldn't recommend not running with it when you have that momentum. I would say utilize the energy, because if you don't, likely that's just going to increase your restlessness. But when you do face burnout, fragmentation, feeling like you're hitting a wall, things like this, just tiredness or whatnot, do try and honor that as well. It's likely that you've made some insane time in terms of productivity as it is. And so taking those periods of time out, when you start to feel like I can't go any further right now, I think that's going to be best. It'll also give your mind more time to process what it is that you've done. And it's in those moments that you're also very likely to have some really wonderful insight about what it is that you're working on. So also when it comes to your own sense of self-expression, this is a major area in which we will find that in our charts. So wanting to feel very liberated, very sovereign in how it is that you express yourself, and throwing off any constraints that you've had around that. So if you've had any inhibition around self-expression or how you present yourself, how you look, what it is that, like how you want to look, if you've been holding yourself back from that, this is likely to really spur you on to break out of that mold, to break out from any social labels that you may have identified with prior, whether in an authentic way or not. This is a period of reinvention, so you get to identify with new things and shed away some things that you no longer identify with. Also breaking out from binaries. So you're allowed to reject both sides of things. I don't know how exactly that's going to wind up, or accept both sides. I don't know how that's going to wind up playing out for each and every Gemini during this time, but you don't need to go with these one or the other, this kind of black and white thinking. There are third and fourth and fifth ways. And if that is what feels more authentic to you, then I would say go with that. Yeah, I kind of spoke to this, but health and appearance, those kinds of changes are likely to come up a lot, and they will be somewhat unexpected. So I would pay attention to those changes so that you're not sticking with a certain way of doing something when it's no longer working for you. So for instance, if you have a weird allergy that arises and you're like, well, it couldn't possibly be this thing that I've always done because I've always done it and I've never had a problem. It might be something that you've always done. This could be something very novel when it comes to health matters, but also when it comes to your appearance. Again, all of this is really intended to push you toward a sense of greater self-sovereignty or personal liberation. And so if something comes up with your body or your appearance or whatever, try not to fight it, but rather than whatever boundaries were there, which are being transgressed or whatever the established norms were that are now subject to change. Try to be as flexible as you can around that. And this is likely then to go better if you're flexible with it. Now, what's so special about this transit is that it's really lighting you up. So you are very much the signal for other people. And some will see you as disruptive. Some are just going to pick up on that because that's something that's coming into the face of your identity during this time. It's right on the surface there is that you are likely to be somewhat disruptive during this time, but you're also likely to be very brilliant during this time as well. And some may see it one or the other way or both. And that whatever they see is a lot less important than that you feel very liberated, that you feel like you are able to be yourself and communicate your own genuine thoughts throughout this period of time. And finally, I do just want to emphasize the first house is you. So it can kind of be anything. And what this is really pointing to, this could be, you could have a career change, you could have a major move, you could have a major spiritual discovery, you could wind up taking a course that winds up changing your life, you could have a major income change that makes you feel differently about your prospects. You could wind up having a child during this period of time, and then your identity is that of a parent now. You may wind up becoming an investor and then identifying in that way. You could wind up exploring new places, new territories, and then discover different parts of yourself and how you can fit into the world a little bit differently. This could draw in new friends. It's really across the board when there's a transit that's taking place in your first house. So I would just recommend rolling with it. It's a wonderful, beautiful thing. It is a gift, without a doubt, Uranus. And especially when it's in Gemini and it's not dealing with a bunch of friction, the more that you can be flexible with that and adaptable and view it as a gift, the more likely that it is to play out in ways that when you look back are clearly quite wonderful, rather than just specifically disruptive. You know, the disruptions are meant to liberate you. That's something really, I think, key to keep in mind throughout these coming years. So yeah, I think that's pretty much what I have for you, Gemini. So I hope that this transit treats you super well, and I will talk to you later. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so for Cancer, we have Uranus and Gemini transiting through your 12th house. And in this place, we have matters that are a bit outside of our control and our awareness. So this is where the subconscious can show up. It's where we can isolate ourselves and become harder to see. It is where we can encounter some really profound challenges for growth and for transcendence. It's where things can go under the radar. It is where a lot of our psychic connection comes through. And it is also where a lot of our spirituality and spiritual practices can come through. And so to have Uranus here, first off, let me share from my own experience, and a lot of what I've heard from Gemini risings is that Uranus and Taurus in our 12th house tended to be pretty quiet a lot of the times. And looking back, it's kind of clear to see how it was behaving. However, the lines are a bit blurred. And that makes sense because it's in this place where this is a little bit more difficult to see what's going on. So you may find that there are some subconscious patterns that you're recognizing, and maybe knowing this at this point will help. to recognize that. But especially if you don't have any placements in this house, I do have to say this one might be pretty quiet for you. And that is nothing to necessarily be sad about. But any sort of conditioning or patterns within your psyche, those are likely to present themselves from time to time in order to liberate you from some habits or constraints that you may subconsciously put upon yourself and may have come from childhood conditioning or something along these lines. Also, your dreams and visions are likely to be a lot sharper and come through in some pretty funky, interesting ways where you may wind up remembering either a lot of your dreams a lot more, or remembering some really poignant dreams in a very vivid way. Or you may wind up having some lucid dreams or things like this, like interesting, strange stuff going on in the subconscious. So another way that this can wind up expressing is through your imagination or any sort of creative endeavors. This can bring the muse through in very just out of the blue kinds of ways. So if that tends to become the case, I would just try and keep a note-taking apparatus of sorts with you so that you can jot those down, because with Uranus and Gemini, it's just as easy for the idea to fall out of your mind as it is for it to come in. Also, your visions of the future, of how things are going to play out, your ability to see through things, and for matters that you should be able to see through become apparent in weird ways. So there may be certain patterns of behavior that for your whole life you've overlooked this, and then for some reason it's just you're able to see it for some reason, and that is again 100% to liberate you from something that you probably were not seeing before. You may even see parts of yourself that you haven't quite seen before. And that can also really liberate you to just know what's going on a little bit more internally and have greater self-understanding. And self-awareness is definitely something that you can see with Uranus in the 12th house. So you may also find yourself drawn into different types of spirituality through technologies or through communicative mediums. So you may pick up on insights through media or find yourself suddenly desiring of solitude. That's one thing that I think is a pattern with Uranus in the 12th, is that there can be the sudden withdrawing from some connections and a desire for deeper connections among those that remain. And you may feel this spiritual or brilliant sense of your experience of solitude during this time. And that may be why, if that kind of an activity, if just being alone, being on your own, hasn't been that fascinating to you, then that may be part of why it's holding your interest more, is that there's more going on in your inner world that is fascinating enough to keep your attention to where you're not desiring to socialize quite as much, or at least not as superficially. So some of the psychic breakthroughs that you're likely to have during this period of time may feel like an ancestral connection. So there could even be a disconnection, which I also have here, of like, sometimes you may feel that if there was a presence that did not feel liberatory that was carrying around with you, you could see that separating from you under this influence, but you may also feel like you are somehow connecting or reconnecting with your roots or ancestral, spiritual, possibly even entities that maybe you were calling in, ancestors, and feel their presence more sharply and more brilliantly. And they could help to guide you with that Uranus there as well. Now, additionally, this is a place of secrets. And that's one thing that will be great to keep in mind, is that you can build up some secrets with others that can serve an interesting kind of a function, especially if there's things that you don't necessarily want shared broadly. You may find ways or people or groups that you're able to connect with along those lines, where it's a little bit more of a private kind of a connection between you. but you may also find some hidden information. And I hate to say that, but there may be some things that you're getting some insight on, which was not really above board. And that could wind up eroding some trust with some people. That in and of itself can then wind up feeding into what we mentioned before of seeking some greater solitude and wanting for your connections to be more meaningful. If you are going to carry them, you're going to want to pretty much connect with people that you trust. And that may even go into trust in institutions that are involved in your life. So you may find that there was something weird. Oh, I'll give you an example. And actually, I have Uranus in my 12th house right now when it's in Taurus. So this is kind of cool and also infuriating. But so I signed up for an Adobe thing for Premiere Pro so I could edit videos. And I was signing up for the monthly deal. And then what I wound up discovering when I went to cancel it, because I was switching back to a different program for editing, was that somewhere in there, and I'm usually pretty good at seeing things like this, was a year-long agreement where the monthly rate was based on agreeing to a year-long contract, which I was completely unaware of. And so now I will no longer ever buy Adobe products again, because I was required to either keep the quote-unquote contract that I somehow unknowingly agreed to, or to pay them $100. So that would be a pretty perfect example of that also then potentially applying to institutions and some kind of sneaky, underhanded, hidden things going on that can erode your trust in an institution. Like I said, I'm never going to buy another Adobe product again because of that. So, because that trust is gone now. So additionally then, like I said, those shocks may feel a little bit isolating, but basically what it's doing is it's clearing out you internally so that you are able to step into a sense of greater inner sovereignty. And then I know this sounds like a crazy long period of time, but in about 7 years then, when Uranus moves into your first house, then you get that external sovereignty. Then you get to really express outwardly that sense of sovereignty. But that is developing throughout this period of time through insights, through little shocks and like revelations, basically, as well as stripping away all of the unnecessary people and connections and things like this, especially those which are not trustworthy. So yeah, I hope that this was of help. I think that's pretty much what I've got for you. But yeah, thank you so much for being here, and I hope that this transit treats you super well. All right, so for Leo, we have Uranus in Gemini transiting in your 11th house of friends, allies, group associations and affiliations, your hopes, dreams, aspirations. So your networks, the friends, the community, the groups that you're involved with, subject to ongoing transformation. And that's one thing I really want to emphasize, is that it's not necessarily just one shift. This is a 7-year-long process of new and potentially falling away, and new and potentially falling away. And maybe there isn't that falling away. Maybe it's just a new thing and a new thing and a new thing. And then you have a whole new set of groups or people that you are involved with by the end of this transit. But it's likely to come in waves with Uranus. And one thing I will say about Uranus in the 11th is it can bring you into groups of people or friends that are quite eccentric in the way that they behave. They might even be kind of rebellious. So this could be social groups which are focused on social change or innovation. This could be like technologically advanced people. This could be an advanced kind of industry group or groups that you wind up finding yourself among. But most straightforward with this would be connecting with some pretty like iconoclastic types of people and groups. And again, it's likely to be social or ideological, something about belief or intelligence, commerce, things like this, basically the things that we went through with Uranus in Gemini. I mean, there may literally be some Geminis coming into your life, or a whole slew of Geminis coming into your life. That's one thing I personally experienced is my 11th is Aries. And when I had Uranus going through that part of my chart, it was just like Aries after Aries after Aries as, new friends, basically. So alliances, subjected to unexpected shifts during this period of time, getting involved in new movements, new group affiliations. You may even find yourself socializing in different ways. So doing different types of activities with people. And again, like a lot of this, it's likely to be affinity groups. It's likely to be what fascinates you, what actually interests you. You're likely to be encountering people who you can connect with along those lines. So based on values, based on like innovative ideas, those are really going to be taking more precedence over just professional alliances, though they may wind up overlapping in different ways. Now, this is also going to be working on your hopes, dreams, aspirations, your goals, what it is that you're trying to achieve for yourself in terms of legacy, reputation, things like this. And so there's likely to be, with Uranus, there's a newness, there's a novelty. And so very likely that you're going to have new hopes and dreams and aspirations, goals, and things like this. And one thing I will say with that, we can only do so much in one life, and I hate to say, at least at once. Let me put it that way. So you might want to prioritize a bit so that you know what's most important, because there's probably going to be a lot of really wonderful aspirations coming through for you, as well as opportunities to achieve those things or to connect with those things. So checking in, trying to make sure that you're pacing yourself correctly with the things that you're trying to achieve throughout this time. And additionally, because of the liberatory nature of Uranus as well, if there are outdated things that you don't want to have as hopes, dreams, goals, aspirations, whatever it is, if you want to change up your career path or the direction in which that is going, please don't let people convince you that you need to stick with something just because, well, that's what you were after, right? So Uranus and Gemini, the point is to flake out on stuff that you don't want anymore. So if you don't feel aligned with something anymore, you don't have to go after it anymore. And that's one message that Uranus and Gemini is going to be bringing to all of us. But for you, it's going to be about what it is that you're going after. You may even find yourself in an interesting type of a leadership role, or at least a role where you really stand out quite a bit. So that's what I mean by you might be seen as a lightning rod in collective settings. So you might be really introducing some brilliant ideas to groups and be seen for that throughout this period of time. It's likely that in group settings, you will be standing out. So you're a Leo. I assume that you're fine with that. But if that's not something that you're the most used to, it would be wise to get used to that around this time. There's not a lot that you're going to be doing or showing up as that's going to go under the radar. So you're likely to serve as something of a spark in those group settings that can be a bit of an upheaval. So I would just watch your words a little bit in group scenarios. So for instance, gossip and stuff like that, which can totally wind up arising, Gemini 11th. With Uranus there, that can go sideways on you. So just try to think those things through, because that could be a bit of that upheaval. That could wind up splitting up some groups and things like that, or ejecting you from a group. But you're also likely to have a really brilliant impact on groups as well. And again, especially when it comes to words with Gemini here. So definitely do your Leo thing of making sure that your words are as affirming as possible, and building people up, shining yourself, letting other people shine. And you should be having a really wonderful then experience of your connections with groups of people. But yeah, I think that's pretty much what I have for you, Leo. So I hope that this transit treats you super well. And thank you so much for being here. All right, so for Virgo, we have Uranus in Gemini transiting through your 10th house of your career, your reputation, legacy, your public standing, what it is that you are seen to be doing in the world and your impact, how it is that you make a mark on the world. And so this is indicative of major breakthroughs. And when it comes to your career, there could totally also be some disruptions that wind up arising. So it is a bit of a double-edged sword in that way. It doesn't mean that you will suddenly lose a job or anything like that. But I will say that if something like that were to arise, which of course that can happen at any time really, this is just as, if not more likely, to bring in a new position as it is to disrupt an existing one. The ways in which, or reasons for which, this would disrupt an existing position is if it feels too confining or it's holding you back. Ultimately, the purpose of Uranus is to liberate you from a situation. And so that's how even those disruptions are ultimately breakthroughs. It's just that as humans, we might not we might not love to have our hand forced at times. But this is also just as likely to bring in public recognition. So you being a bit of a spark and getting a lot more attention out in the world for what it is that you're doing, and especially as your role, as your position. And what's likely to be going on with your career around this time is some quirks. So the old success models, the old structures, the old way of going about career and making a mark and creating a future for yourself, creating a path for yourself, it's likely to be much more unique, much more eccentric, much more rebellious. You are redefining what success means, and you're making that fit you rather than vice versa. And so when it comes to purpose, prestige, status, things like that, there are these status quo types of ready-made, packaged definitions of that were provided in this world. Of course, we know this. But it doesn't work for everyone. And clearly for you, it seems like that is much less likely to function properly during this period of time than is creating your own sense of what that means. So I will say that if you are holding on to any of those ready-made definitions around what success is for you, that's where you're most likely to run into some quote unquote unwelcome disruptions and things, is because then Uranus is going to look at the situation and say, okay, clearly I need to force this. Clearly I'm going to need to force this person's hand to recognize that holding on to things that they don't actually like and don't actually value just because it's what they quote unquote should or have been told that they need to be doing in order to satisfy the standards and expectations of other people, Uranus isn't going to stand for that. So either you'll need to be open to creating a sense of success for yourself and trying your best to follow that path, or Uranus will do it for you, So I always recommend working with the planets as much as possible. And I do think that this can be a thing that it's not the easiest for Virgo, and yet, boy, is it really, as far as I've known you guys, pretty much across the board. You are quirky. You're part of the mutable bunch of quirky weirdos, but you're also an earth sign. And so there can be a sense of the anxiety of having to push out into your own, the sense of, oh, well, if it works for other people, who am I to question that, kind of a thing that can sometimes come up with Virgo. And so I would say this would ask you to push against that as far as you are comfortable with it without making yourself too anxious around it, So new industries, platforms, tech paths are likely to open up for you in terms of opportunities. And so, like I said, the industry, if you're in a given industry, you may shift into something else. Whatever that is that you're shifting into, likely to be a little bit less straightforward or normal or conventional. Also, you can connect with people across platforms with Gemini that may have some really wonderful opportunities for you as well. And then Uranus and Gemini are techie in and of themselves. So if that is something that you have been wanting to weave into what it is that you're doing, or how it is that you are laying the path out before yourself to get to something that you're wanting to create, then I would highly recommend that you utilize platforms and technologies, or even tech industry, if that's something that you're wanting to go toward. There are also likely to be disruptions if you're dealing with an authority figure that is, how do I put this in a way where I'm not actually saying what I deeply mean, that's jerky. You're dealing with any jerky authority figures or something like this, it's unlikely to work out. You're unlikely to be able to grasp onto whatever that is for very long. In part because the urges to not be dealing with that will get stronger. And if you manage to hold on and resist even that, then again, that's where Uranus can start kicking externally and cause things to kind of fall apart. So if you're in a situation where you just don't like it, you don't like the people that you're dealing with, if someone is trying to really dominate you within a working situation, I think that the best thing you can do in that situation with this kind of an alignment for best results would be to look for those opportunities to get out of that. And additionally, Uranus would love for you to go independent. So if that is something that is an idea that's percolating, I would say to whatever extent you can establish that in the background for yourself and get yourself to a point where you can maybe step out of a difficult situation, I would try to run with that. If it's not something that you're interested in, then yeah, I would just connect with people, like I was saying, with the platforms and technology and stuff like that, connecting with people looking for opportunities. You're really likely to find a bridge when you're looking for it. But yeah, additionally, when it comes to any sort of chaotic or hectic or highly pressurized situations that wind up arising, if those are happening in your workplace, in your industry, if this is even a role that you carry which isn't specifically career, but it's still a big part of your reputation, like if you're seen as a community leader or something like this, then you're likely to be able to navigate a lot of that upheaval or weird energy with a great amount of brilliance. And you should then be able to really inspire others to navigate that well and to find a sense of liberation or emancipation through whatever that upheaval is. So if that's also something that you would enjoy to be doing around this time, to be leading others in a kind of iconoclastic way throughout this period of time, this Uranus would really be encouraging you to go in that direction. So I would also reinforce its encouragement for you to do that. And do keep in mind, if you're Virgo, you're ruled by Mercury, so is Gemini. So your ruler, Mercury, is housing in one of its signs and one of its domiciles, Uranus. So this is going to be a very important transit for you in addition to for Gemini. So just worth keeping in mind, even though it's a different sign, it's still your ruler that's housing it. So it's your ruler will be flavored by that iconoclast being in its home, you know. So yeah, I think that's pretty much what I have for you, Virgo. So I hope that this transit treats you super well. And thank you so much for being here. All right, so for Libra, we have Uranus and Gemini transiting through your 9th house. And the 9th house has a lot to do with the expansion of your mind and your horizons. And so to me, there's a lot of matters of humanities that come up here. So culture, history, philosophy, all manner of human subjects wind up showing up in this house. We also see law and matters of travel, as well as education as a whole, in addition to teaching. So it's really like a place of personal growth to better understand the world, your own worldview, your own sense of belief and perspective, as well as to better understand how it is that you fit into that and how it is that you can grow through a greater understanding of the world and all of the things that are in it, especially those aspects of it that are fascinating to you personally. So this period of time is likely to bring in some really big shifts and continual shifts, continual breakthroughs, continual revelations that wind up informing your worldview or your sense of belief. Your perspective is undergoing some really wonderful developments throughout this period of time, which are going to be ongoing and surprising. You may find yourself just connecting really brilliantly with materials. So written materials, communiques, just different perspectives, different worldviews, different countries, different cultures. There's likely to be just flashes of greater and greater understanding and knowledge along those lines. You may also find some surprises with education. So you may suddenly find yourself in a teaching position or in a new course of study. You're likely to be fascinated by learning materials around this time. So even if this is not a formal study or formal teaching kind of a situation that you're in, you're likely to be engaging with people in discussion a lot more about worldly topics, or connecting with people along those lines, or reading a huge amount more. This can totally be an autodidact thing where you are teaching yourself various different topics. And again, it's probably going to be various, not just one. It's almost never one thing when you're dealing with Gemini. So also potentially some new and really wonderful international connections for you. So you may find yourself suddenly moving or traveling overseas in ways that you did not quite expect. You may find some really wonderful opportunities overseas for you through new connections, or at the very least, learning about other cultures a lot more, connecting to international media, things like this. But yeah, when it comes to mental, intellectual growth and development, this is leaps and bounds. So you may want to see if you can weave together all of the different things that you're learning, because your mind is going to be going a lot throughout this period of time. You're likely to be just learning a whole ton of stuff. As much as you can weave that together would be really wonderful, whether that be on a personal level or in an intentionally interdisciplinary way. You may even find yourself studying an interdisciplinary topic. That's always what I loved to do. And I have so much Gemini in my chart. So it's likely that it's going to wind up playing out that way, where you are weaving together different topics and seeing how very divergent ways of looking at things can inform each other and become greater than the sum of their parts. And then, yeah, just like wonderful, shocking revelations, things that you did not expect to be learning, especially when it comes to higher knowledge. So not just information, but knowledge, things that you weren't expecting to understand. This is kind of a place where it's something you can't unsee. It's something that genuinely sticks with you as knowledge. Whereas in the third house, we can kind of come across information and let it go. It usually is developing into something in the ninth house. Now, you may be connecting beyond just moving overseas or traveling more, which I would also expect, connecting with the world more through technology. So that could also wind up, obviously, something along the lines of the internet or whatever, but that could wind up having a really profound impact on your personal development. So you may find yourself in a community with Uranus and Gemini that is global or international at the very least in the ninth house, that has a really wonderful, expansive impact on you personally. Now, also, I would watch out for law stuff, especially around the things that you're saying and the things that you are admitting. So if you run into a legal issue, I would not say anything more than you have to, because that could be something weird that could wind up coming up. But then also, if you're already in a course of study, you may find this would be a very standard way that this would wind up playing out. You're no longer interested in that, and you're wanting to go in a different direction because you don't quite identify with whatever that was, or you're not quite as interested anymore. So if that winds up arising, please, for the love of God, do not stick with something just because you've already started. If this is calling for you to get out of something, if you're feeling an urge to change and you don't, that's when this starts to go a bit sideways. And that's when it starts to act a little bit outside of our control. And so you may find then that you're hitting a bit of an academic wall, or that you just cannot force yourself to finish something, or something along these lines, where that can become genuinely disruptive. Also, philosophical disruption. So you may be discussing your worldview with people as you would in a very normal way with Uranus and Gemini in the ninth. Someone may say something that winds up really introducing something to you that winds up completely reframing over the course of time of engaging with whatever that new perspective is. Your whole worldview could wind up subject to far-reaching changes based on some things that you encounter in discussion with people. And ultimately, this is also a place of publishing. I didn't mention that, but when it comes to publishing books, blogs, videos, things like that, audio, this is really wonderful for that, because it does say that you are speaking to something which is topically relevant to the time that you're in. It is very much of the now, and probably speaking to future matters. And so you're likely to have a really wonderful, brilliant way of packaging that such that it can create a spark and can get people's attention. If you're publishing, you're likely to be surprised by the attention that winds up coming in. And so I would say, if there's something that you've been considering publishing, or if you've been thinking about doing a YouTube channel, if you've been thinking about publishing a book or starting a blog or something like this, then I would say, or even signing up to volunteer at a local radio station or something like that, to the extent that those still exist and they're not all just owned by Clearwater if you're in the United States. You are definitely called to engage in things like that. And again, you're likely to be surprised by the results. So communicating your perspective, communicating your vision of how the future could be, is something really wonderful that you can do with this Uranus. And it's likely to have some really pleasant, surprising results. But yeah, I think that is pretty much what I have for you, Libra. So I hope that this transit treats you super well. And thank you so much for being here. All right, so for Scorpio, we have Uranus in Gemini transiting through your 8th house of shared resources, interdependency, intimacy, vulnerability, inheritances, debts, things like this, taboo topics. We also see psychology show up here a lot, especially psychology, which is related to interdependence or the psychological well-being of other people, as well as like how you see yourself relative to other people, your trust of yourself relative to others. So there's likely to be a lot of developments and changes, shifts, upheaval in these areas. So this could be impacting, your shared resources, debts, things like this. There may be a surprise settlement or inheritance, or surprises around those things, as well as a new kind of entanglement with other people, with someone else, which could be a very significant relationship as well, which is likely then to be quite unique or eccentric as a connection with someone else. It could wind up feeling more like a really deep friendship with Gemini here. Now, when it comes to the death, rebirth kinds of topics that we also see with the 8th house, we could see some surprises around that, as well as with sexual relationships or financial relationships, those vulnerabilities and connections, the entanglements that we have with other people. And you may be having those experiences in ways that are surprising to you. So handling those matters in ways that you wouldn't previously have thought that you would. That's where a lot of that surprise might even wind up coming in, is on the way that you handle those types of connections with other people. This is also a place of research, so digging into things that tend to be under the radar, things that tend to be hidden or that people tend to not address. So you may be finding yourself experiencing some sense of liberation through research or digging into topics. So again, especially when it comes to psychology and psychological matters, to me, when you're getting an interesting kind of a transit to the eighth house, I think that's a really wonderful way to utilize that is through this next topic we have of like psychological awakenings. You can do that through researching, learning about psychology, learning about your own as well as other people's and how those things work together, as well as through confronting taboos. So topics that have stayed under the surface for some time could definitely wind up arising, things that others may have tried to hide or sweep under the rug or not quite deal with. That may also wind up coming to the fore for you. So also when it comes to traumas, if you have any sort of past traumas, this is an opportunity to confront that, to look at that, to release that in order to liberate yourself from the residues or remnants of those past traumas or difficult experiences that you may have had. And that then catalyzing a sense of transformation of yourself and of your trust in yourself and your trust in others, especially. So if those are topics that have been of significance to you around possibly losing trust in others writ large due to the fact that certain people have subjected you to difficult situations, this would be an opportunity. It would present many opportunities to be able to look at that, be really honest with yourself about that, and work through it and experience a sense of psychological awakening through that process and through looking at that. Additionally, when it comes to power dynamics, the more difficult of those, Uranus doesn't love that kind of a thing. And it's very likely to, one, make something very apparent to you so that it's not going on under the surface. It'll bring it to the fore and to free you from that. So if you're already in a type of a power dynamic that feels intolerable, this hopefully, if you're willing to work with it, it should help you to see ways out of dealing with that. And otherwise, it may have you slipping and calling something out. So that's a bit of a thing, is that there will be a sense of loose lips with Uranus in Gemini at times. And that might be something you want to watch out for a bit, but also do keep in mind, it's going to be impossible to keep that in forever. So better to try to change the situation than to just try and stay quiet about it. And this is likely to really require a lot of detachment. Uranus can be quite detached, so can Gemini. And so when it comes to vulnerable or intimate or power dynamic laden connections with other people that aren't very equal, it will require for sure a lot of detachment in order for you to deal with that in the most authentic way possible. But that is ultimately what's called for here, is what types of power dynamics are you comfortable with, and are you being really authentic with yourself about that? If not, and it's a relationship that you can afford to lose, to put it bluntly, then I would say it warrants a discussion at the very least about that. And hopefully you can be as authentic in that as possible for the sake of a sense of liberation from any sort of a power dynamic that you don't feel like you genuinely consent to. There may also be some surprise lessons here around those matters, especially to me, 8th house, big time power dynamics go on here. So there may just be some weird insights that you wind up running across, that wind up being presented to you, and possibly patterns that you've overlooked for a while with regard to how people treat each other or whatnot, that are really hard to overlook at this point. So when those things arise, I would do your best to see it as a gift. We are dealing with Uranus, which does tend to bear some gifts, but those gifts are of liberation, and that's not necessarily always the easiest thing to encounter and to really detach from. So it may require some effort to be cool about that kind of a thing, but it will definitely present itself to you if that's a matter that is relevant. I would also be a little bit careful about words in contracts. I know that we don't really read our end user license agreements and stuff like that, but to the extent that you can be very clear about what's going on in contracts, I would recommend that with Uranus in Gemini, because that's a surprise of words in a contract in the 8th house. So worth very much keeping a keen eye on what it is that you're signing on to, both intimately and literally on paper. But yeah, I think that that is pretty much what I have for you, Scorpio. So I hope that this transit treats you super well. And thank you so much for being here. All right, so for Sagittarius, we have Uranus in Gemini transiting through your 7th house of partnerships and other people. We can also see contracts and agreements in the 7th house as well. So when it comes to your partnerships, there's likely to be some surprises, some unexpected twists and turns in those connections with people. And that can be romantic partnerships, it can be professional partnerships, but it can also be with close friends and any other significant one-on-one connections that you have with other people. You're likely also to draw in very eccentric types of people. So those who buck conventions, those who are quite brilliant, those who have some very unique or iconoclastic ideas or attitudes to them. But on the other hand, Uranus is not the most reliable of things. And so sometimes with Uranus in the 7th, we can wind up dealing with people who are unpredictable or unreliable or a little bit erratic. So that is something to keep in mind, to try not to have very important things dependent upon other people showing up quite the way that you would like for them to. Because sometimes people will drop the ball. Not all the time, but sometimes they will. Sometimes people will come through in really wonderful ways that you aren't expecting as well. Additionally, any connections that you have that are close, which are quite confining or that feel restrictive in some way, people who feel quite, say, judgmental or just that you feel box you in or limit your options or limit your ability to express yourself freely. Those are likely to come apart with this kind of an influence. And so it does offer an opportunity to break down some of those less than satisfying connections. But additionally, when it comes to how you do relationships, you're unlikely to be able to abide that kind of a thing. And so the new connections, which are even more likely to wind up coming in as Uranus tends to bring a sense of newness or novelty with it, those are likely to be structured very differently. And so liberation or feeling very free within a relationship winds up becoming very important to you. And hopefully, additionally, your sense of control over others, I know that's a strong term, but your rules or whatnot for others when it comes to themselves are also likely to be lessened throughout this period of time. So like I said, agreements, even contracts can wind up playing out in this house as well. So those are subject to a lot of change, and that might happen suddenly. You may have a contract, say, with a company around something, and then suddenly they go bankrupt, and now that contract is no longer valid. Now, opinions may also wind up shifting, and those are also subject to change. So the agreements that you make with other people, but additionally, the people that you are dealing with, they are also very changeable. So you may have some people, if you are married, your partner could be going through some really significant changes around this time. They may seem to be quite different. And it's almost like having a partner who's dealing with a first house Uranus transit, where it's impacting them directly. And again, this doesn't just have to be a marriage partner, but it could also speak to business partners or to close friends. So with Uranus, it can really push you to evolve, to develop, to grow in leaps and bounds. And so with it in the 7th house, it does speak to the fact that relationships can help to push you forward. It can really help you to progress and develop personally as well through those relationships. So you may just be having the types of connections that push you to grow, basically. I'm not really sure how else to say that, although I don't really feel like I'm hitting it on the head. But the types of relationships that can be quite inspiring for you to be more. So you may wind up connecting with people that themselves really inspire you and that impress you. And that could then in turn lead you to feel like there's something more that I want to be doing. And so you may find a lot of inspiration from the people that you're connecting with on a personal level there as well. But yeah, I think that is pretty much what I have for you, Sagittarius. So I hope that this transit treats you super well. And thank you so much for being here. All right, so for Capricorn rising, we have Uranus in Gemini transiting through your 6th house of your routine, your working life, the tasks you do, as well as your health. We can even see matters of being of service to others showing up in this place, that which you feel a strong desire to fight for, to push for, and that you're willing to put time and energy into. So this area of routine and your work with rhythms are likely to shift and change. You may find that there are more distractions, unfortunately. I hate to say that, but there's likely to be more distractions when you are trying to get things done. You may find it a little bit more difficult to focus as well while you are trying to work. So it would be great to try and plan around that, to try to actively minimize the vectors of potential distraction. So utilizing do not disturb on your phone as much as you can, minimizing your proclivity to multitask, because you're going to be very tempted to do that as well with Uranus in Gemini in the 6th. Now, this does also offer you the opportunity to intentionally change up your routine or your work rhythms. So if you've been hoping to make a pretty far-reaching change to how it is that you go about your day, this should be very helpful for that, especially if you're trying to free yourself up in one way or another. Health routines are also really wonderful to change up during this time in order to make yourself more healthy, basically. So if you can be proactive about that, that would be really wonderful. If you want to go on walks more, something like that, that would also be really supported by this. But being more physically active is likely under this influence, and that would also be a really wonderful way to work off any of the excess energy that this may bring up for you. It may have you feeling a bit restless because this is a sign that has to do with your body. So if you're feeling kind of anxious or restless or whatnot, I would definitely recommend utilizing that energy physically. So doing some sort of exercise or getting that energy out of you somehow. Also, if you are interested in any sort of healing modalities, something like this, you may be really extra fascinated to go into that kind of a direction personally or even professionally. And this would also help a lot with that, with insights and a greater understanding of healing itself and how to effectuate that for yourself and others. Now, when this comes to jobs, you can also have some major shifts around that. So you may find yourself in a new role, a new position. You could find yourself leaving a position, especially if it feels constraining or like it's holding you back in some way. It would be best to not ignore that, but rather to try to plan ahead for a change that you're making willingly. Because if something really is confining and intolerable, then Uranus and Gemini in this place will probably have that fall apart anyway. And so better to be in control of it than to let Uranus just do it on its own. You may even find yourself in a more technological orientation with your work, or utilizing or having to utilize technology a lot more with your work. Now, you could streamline your routine or streamline some of your work utilizing technology. For instance, if there is some way that you're able to take parts of your work and do that through AI or something like that, then that would be a great way to utilize this, but it may come up in some other way as well. You may even wind up in some eccentric type of industry or field, or be training for something like that as well. Now, Uranus and Gemini are also both pretty distant, so I also would not be surprised to see you in a position that winds up remote, to where you're not working on site. You may even find that the location of your work is variable in some way, where maybe there's multiple locations that you're needing to deal with, or maybe there's an element of travel that's also entering this place. You may even find yourself needing to communicate with different people, either within the company or outside of it, in ways that are also subject to a lot of change. Burnout is also a potential here. So you may find that you're making a huge amount of momentum and that you're really moving ahead, and then you feel like you hit a wall. So try to respect that burnout. Try to pull back before you hit that point. So try to avoid it if you possibly can. But if you don't, just hopefully you can recognize, well, I made a lot of progress, so it's okay if I take some time out to recharge my batteries, basically. Because that nervous energy is going to be working in the background. And much as that can be helpful for catalyzing a lot of progress and productivity, it can also be kind of draining and tiring to just have that as background noise. So try to honor and respect the fact that that's also probably going on in your body a bit. And that just because at times you'll find, wow, I'm able to get 8 hours of work done in 3 hours, that doesn't mean that you can do that for 8 hours. So something to keep in mind. This is also a place of effective solutions. So coming up with solutions. So when it comes to problem solving, when it comes to figuring out the logistics or other types of solutions, how to make things work, how to organize things most effectively, when it comes to matters of efficiency, you can have some really brilliant insights along those lines. So that's something that you'll also likely be contributing productively, either professionally or to your own life as well. And so if there are outdated or restrictive or inefficient systems that you're having to work with, either personally, for others, or for some sort of a workplace, you should be able to contribute a lot to solving for that, to updating that to make it more efficient so that there's less wasted energy, or to then help break out of some of those inefficient systems. So for instance, maybe there's a contract with a specific type of program or whatever, and it's very maddening to deal with it. Maybe there's terrible service, or maybe it is a poorly coded program that winds up breaking down or something. There's solutions there, and you should be really well positioned to be able to find those. But yeah, I think that is most of what I have for you, Capricorn. So I hope that this transit treats you super well. And thank you so much for being here. All right, so for Aquarius, we have Uranus and Gemini transiting through your 5th house. And so this is a place of personal expression, of creativity, hobbies, interests, the things that you enjoy. This is also where children show up, as well as matters of your own childhood. This is also a place of joy. So this can come through as a lot of inspiration. So especially inspiration, which winds up sparking creativity or excitement. So new projects, new hobbies and interests and things like this that wind up, like especially creative ones, where you feel like you're able to express yourself, are likely to present themselves to you at this time. And what's also interesting about this is that Uranus could even wind up liberating you in other ways through those interests, so through your joys. So this could speak to doing something that you love, and then if you run with that professionally, maybe becoming more financially independent or more professionally independent through following that creative spark, through following your inspiration. So it should be that your joys do lead you in some pretty positive but surprising directions during this time as well. Now, this is also the place of romantic relationships as well. And so there may be a new romantic partnership that winds up arising, or several as well. And when it comes to your children, this can also be a lot of surprises with them. So they may become a lot more eccentric throughout this period of time, or they may just have some really wonderful breakthroughs or milestones that you wind up celebrating in the coming several years too. They may even wind up becoming a lot more independent and developing personalities, or developing upon their personalities, their interests, their identities in ways that you didn't quite expect, but should be hopefully quite a pleasant surprise. Also, when it does come to your self-expression, any imposition of inhibitions or restrictions there will become less and less tolerable. So this is really encouraging you to be deeply authentic when it comes to your self-expression, really honoring what it is that you like and who it is that you are. So those romantic partnerships that wind up arising during this time, they themselves may even wind up being kind of erratic, being a bit eccentric, being very exciting, but also pretty liberating. So they may also not follow the same type of structure of relationships that you've had in the past. So the traditional standard way that you experience romantic relationships, these are likely to be very different from that, and to have a greater sense of freedom within those connections too. Additionally, when it comes to some of these joys, or even the new hobbies and interests that wind up coming in, they might not be conventional. They might be very eccentric interests that wind up arising for you. Like if you're getting really into astrology or horticulture or some type of niche media or some kind of small scene or something like that, then this would be really encouraging you to follow that path. So you have full permission from this placement and all of the excuses in the world to just get into super weird stuff that feels fascinating around this period of time. Also, I do have to say, with Uranus in Gemini, we're all going to flake out on certain things. And so if you've had interests in the past that you've run with for a while, don't be shy. If you're no longer interested in those things, to drop them and just go in a completely new direction. That's really what's called for here, is to follow what really brings you joy, what really holds your interest. So if that makes a major pivot, then go with it, totally. And now, of course, I have another typo here. But yeah, when it comes to creativity, art, games, romance, any other joyous activities like that, it can be very liberating. So you may have a lot more fun with this. You may find that this is an area of life where you're putting a lot more of your focus to just live it up and enjoy your life. And that life is for enjoyment, for the sake of enjoying. But it may also be very revealing. So you may wind up learning a lot about yourself through engaging with the different aspects of life that you genuinely enjoy. It may even be revealing about your own childhood. So you may be learning a lot about yourself through these activities and breaking out of the mold of what types of activities you would usually engage in, or people at large would usually engage in. But yeah, other than that, it should just feel like a really wonderful, brilliant muse that comes through here and there with sparks of insight and inspiration. If you are a creative type, this should have you really engaging authentically with your craft, and doing so in a way that can garner a lot of attention because it's so unique and it carries such a very real part of you. I also wouldn't shy away from, if you are a creative type, utilizing online communities and things like that to share your work broadly. You never know what might wind up developing from doing so. But yeah, I think that that is pretty much what I have for you, Aquarius. So I hope that this transit treats you super well. And thank you so much for being here. All right, finally, last but not least, we have Pisces. So for you Pisces, Uranus in Gemini will be transiting through your fourth house, which primarily has to do with your home and family, your roots, your core, your soul, that core of your being, as well as ancestry, heritage, things like that. So there's likely to be a lot of surprises and changes in this area in your home with regard to your family, with your sense of rootedness. So straightforwardly, this could absolutely indicate a move that you'll be doing, that you're going to be living somewhere else. Barring that, this would indicate a major change within your home. So either through the addition or subtraction of members of your home or family, or major physical changes, renovations to your home. And that would likely be related to something that just doesn't feel like it fits anymore, something that you don't quite like anymore. There may also be some breakages in the home that's unexpected. Certainly air conditioning, things like that, that somehow could be connected to Gemini. I wouldn't be surprised to see something along those lines. I'd also take things like wind and tornadoes and stuff like this very seriously. So any weatherproofing that you're able to do around the home should be pretty well advised. Additionally, if you feel constrained when considering your ancestry or heritage, if you feel like there's some tradition there that you felt tied to that just doesn't feel quite right, this would enable you to step outside of that and to liberate yourself from that. However, if there is some sense in which you are able to feel a greater sense of authenticity and a sense of your own uniqueness through connecting with your roots, then this would also help with that quite a bit, to bring some revelations and some insights along those lines, which themselves could be liberatory. Either way that it goes, the point of it is to free you up, to make you feel like you're able to be more authentic. Now, you may also be tempted to bring technology into your home more, so like smart home devices and things like that. You may also want to modernize your decorating or something like this. But some of the moving might be an ongoing type of thing with Uranus here, especially Uranus and Gemini. So digital nomadism, or if you're working remotely, nomadism in some way. If you work for yourself, you could possibly do it that way as well. But you may find yourself kind of perpetually moving for a little while as well. And your ties to community, to family, the living arrangements, those can also wind up subject to ongoing change. So you may find yourself in tight-knit communities that themselves are quite unique or eccentric, or that are based on feeling very safe together, feeling like you can really be yourself with them. There may even be a unique form of a living situation, like if you are living in some kind of planned community of any sort, or you may find an opportunity to live in a community like that, where it's not just a single home dwelling occupied by a nuclear family in the suburbs or in the city or something like this, not just an apartment that you have, but maybe living within some kind of a community in some unique form. And that will probably then follow on from some inspiration to be liberated from the confines or the restrictions of standard living situations, or even from family, or where it is that you come from. So you may find your way out of that is through some unique living arrangement. Also, with this being your core, your emotional core and your soul, this can work in these shocking kind of flashes of insight to your emotional body. And so that can come in waves and be a kind of repeated experience over the coming years, that can help you to heal and to break free from some familiar molds or some familiar confines, even some old story or old narrative about yourself and your roots, or like your origin narrative around yourself, and what that says about what's possible for you. This can help you to really emotionally break free from that, so that you're not held back by, be it heritage, be it conditioning from childhood, or just some experience that may have happened earlier in life that had you feeling a certain way, even based on the country that you live in, or the town or community and the expectations there. This can have you feeling much freer to break free from those kinds of traditions or cultures or things like this. This can also speak directly to parents or family members and changes that are going on with them, especially like they might be behaving in a more eccentric or even erratic manner, but I wouldn't take that so much as like a threat or a risk or a problem. It doesn't have to be any sort of a problem with that, but you might just be seeing that the people around you are changing, and that can be in ways that you like or that you don't like. And then, of course, that would potentially even necessitate some personal change to either integrate with that and free yourself in similar ways as those around you are, or to break free from maybe a relationship in which you are growing apart. So there may even be, with the fourth house being the core and the roots, there may even be a stemming off from or branching off from family. This could even be you creating your own family out of a previous form of family. So having your own children, creating your own family, and doing that quite a bit differently than your childhood and your parents did things. Your role as a parent may even be shifting. If you are a parent, this could be like your children are moving out, and therefore your parental role itself is shifting and freeing you up. But yeah, I think that that's pretty much what I have for you, Pisces. So thank you so much for being here, and I hope that this transit treats you super well.